You feeling better this morning? You say, yes! Bullfrog!
Happy Days was never just a television show. It was a reflection of a simpler time, a nostalgic window into an idealized version of 1950s and early 1960s America. For over a decade, it brought audiences into a world of diners, leather jackets, jukeboxes, and friendships that felt unbreakable. It told stories that were lighthearted yet meaningful, grounded in everyday life but elevated by characters who felt larger than life. And for millions of viewers, it became more than entertainment, it became comfort. When Happy Days first premiered in 1974, it arrived at a moment when audiences were longing for something familiar. The world outside was changing rapidly, filled with uncertainty and cultural shifts. But this show offered something steady. It gave viewers a place where problems were simpler, solutions were clearer, and relationships felt strong and dependable. It wasn't just about the past, it was about what people wished the past had been. At the center of it all was Richie Cunningham, the all-American teenager navigating life with sincerity and curiosity. Around him were his family, his friends, and a growing cast of characters who would eventually define the show. But no character would become more iconic than Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli. Played with effortless charisma, Fonzie quickly became the heart of Happy Days. He was cool, confident, and seemingly untouchable, yet beneath that exterior was a loyalty and warmth that audiences connected with instantly. As the show progressed, it evolved. What began as a family-centered sitcom gradually shifted focus. Fonzie, originally a supporting character, became the central figure. His popularity was undeniable. Audiences were drawn to his presence, his style, and his unique way of solving problems with a mix of toughness and unexpected wisdom. The show adapted to that popularity, placing him at the forefront of its storytelling. For a time, this worked perfectly. Ratings soared. Catchphrases became part of everyday language. The show became one of the most recognizable programs on television. It wasn't just successful, it was dominant. It defined an era of television, shaping how sitcoms approached character-driven storytelling. But success, as it often does, brought change. And over time, those changes began to alter the very identity of the show. The early seasons of Happy Days were grounded. They focused on family dynamics, teenage experiences, and relatable situations. But as the show leaned more heavily into Fonzie's character, the tone began to shift. The stories became broader, more exaggerated. The grounded realism that once defined the show slowly gave way to larger, more outlandish scenarios. At first, these changes were subtle, a slightly more dramatic situation here, a more comedic exaggeration there. But as the seasons went on, the balance continued to shift. The show that once felt like a reflection of real life began to feel more like a performance. The characters were still there, but the world around them was changing. This evolution was not unusual for long-running shows. As audiences become familiar with characters, there is often a push to keep things fresh, to introduce new elements that maintain interest. But there is a delicate balance between evolution and transformation. And in the case of Happy Days, that balance began to tip. By the mid to late 1970s, the show had reached the height of its popularity. It was one of the most watched programs on television, and its influence extended far beyond the screen. But beneath that success, there were signs that something was beginning to change. The storytelling was becoming more ambitious, but also more disconnected from the grounded tone that had originally defined the series. The focus on spectacle and exaggerated situations began to replace the simplicity that audiences had once loved. And while the show remained popular, the foundation that made it special was starting to shift. This brings us to the moment that would come to define its legacy. A scene that, at the time, may have seemed like just another attempt to entertain, but in hindsight, became something much more significant. It was during a storyline that pushed the boundaries of what Happy Days had traditionally been. Fonzie, the character who had become the symbol of cool, found himself in a situation that felt entirely out of place in the world the show had originally created. In this now infamous scene, Fonzie, wearing his signature leather jacket, attempts to jump over a shark while on water skis. On the surface, it was meant to be exciting, a dramatic, attention-grabbing moment designed to keep audiences engaged. But something about it felt different. It was no longer grounded. It no longer reflected the reality, even the idealized reality, that the show had built. It felt exaggerated, forced, disconnected, and for many viewers, it marked a turning point. This was not just another episode. It was a moment that seemed to signal a shift in the show's identity. The character of Fonzie, once defined by a quiet confidence and subtle charm, was now part of a spectacle that felt more like a stunt than a story. At the time, reactions were mixed. Some viewers enjoyed the boldness of the scene, others saw it as a departure from what made the show special. But as time went on, that moment took on a different meaning. It became symbolic, not just of that episode, but of the direction the show was heading. The phrase, "jumping the shark," would eventually enter popular culture, used to describe the moment when a television show begins to decline, when it goes too far in an attempt to maintain relevance. And that phrase came directly from this scene. It wasn't that Happy Days ended immediately after that moment. The show continued for several more seasons. Characters remained, stories continued, and audiences still watched. But something had changed. The tone was different. The connection felt weaker. The simplicity that once defined the show was harder to find. Over time, cast changes also began to affect the show. Key characters left, new ones were introduced, and the dynamic that once felt so natural began to shift. Richie Cunningham, the original center of the story, eventually departed. His absence changed the balance of the show, leaving a gap that could not easily be filled. Fonzie remained, but even his presence could not fully restore what had been lost. The show continued, but it was no longer the same. By the early 1980s, Happy Days was no longer the dominant force it once had been. Audience tastes were changing, and the television landscape was evolving. New shows were emerging, offering different styles of storytelling. What once felt fresh now felt familiar. And eventually, after 11 seasons, the show came to an end. But when people look back on Happy Days, they don't just remember its final episode. They remember that moment. That scene. The one that seemed to capture the exact point where everything shifted. The moment where the show crossed a line from authenticity into exaggeration. The moment where it tried to become something bigger, and in doing so, lost something essential. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a sudden cancellation. It was a gradual change, marked by a single, unforgettable image. Fonzie, on water skis, jumping over a shark. That image became more than just a scene, it became a symbol. A symbol of what happens when a show loses its balance, when it moves too far away from what made it special in the first place. And yet, despite that moment, the legacy of Happy Days remains strong, because one scene does not erase everything that came before it. The early seasons still exist. The characters still resonate. The laughter still feels genuine. For many viewers, the show represents a time when television felt simpler, more personal, more connected. It represents a kind of storytelling that focused on relationships, on everyday moments, on the small things that make life meaningful. And even though it changed, even though it evolved, those early moments are still there. Still remembered. Still valued. The story of Happy Days is not just about its ending. It's about its journey, its rise, its peak, and its gradual transformation. The scene that ended Happy Days forever was not the final episode. It was not a farewell or a goodbye. It was a moment in the middle of its run. A moment that revealed something deeper about the nature of television. That even the most beloved shows are not immune to change. That success can sometimes lead to excess. and that maintaining authenticity is one of the hardest challenges any story can face. In the end, Happy Days remains an important part of television history, not just because of its success, but because of what it represents, a reminder of how powerful simple storytelling can be, and a reminder of how easily that simplicity can be lost. And that is why, for so many, that one scene is remembered, not as a failure, but as a turning point, the moment everything changed, the scene that ended Happy Days forever.